población LGTBQI+. Bueno, yo me presento, soy Ariel Farroni, soy el presidente actual del chapter argentino. Ahora lo vamos a presentar a Matthew. Lo primero que quería hacer es agradecerle a Alejandra Goldschmidt, que está acá presente, por el contacto, habernos hecho el contacto con Matthew. Yo realmente tuve el placer, el honor, el gusto de cursar la formación que Ale empezó a desarrollar acá en Argentina, una formación muy pionera, completa, que aborda tanto cuestiones sociales, políticas, históricas, como cuestiones técnicas relacionadas a la terapia de aceptación y compromiso y de las terapias contextuales y la cuestión específica de la diversidad. Realmente tuve el gusto enorme porque me abrió la cabeza muchísimo. Y eso fue a partir de que Matthew, bueno, visitó la Argentina. Quizás después me pueden corregir bien o aportar bien el año. Hace unos años que fue invitado por Ale también. Bueno, y a partir de esa
2018 vino Matthew
2018
y 2019 fue la primer camada.
comenzaron con la formación. Perfecto, pionera y además casi única porque la verdad que, no sé, siento que serían buenas más formaciones en relación al tema. Sé que hay otras, pero realmente la formación que inició Ale es la que conocí de primera fuente y me parece súper importante. Esto lo vamos a incluir en las preguntas a Matthew porque seguramente hay una diferencia entre lo que es una atención amable o aceptante de lo que es las presentaciones relacionadas a la diversidad de género y otra diferente, otra intervención diferente, logramos como terapeutas, en el acceso a la atención y en la calidad de atención, en la sensibilidad que tenemos con respecto al tema cuando conocemos, hasta les diría, la historia de los procesos de lucha y de las cuestiones específicas como la discriminación específica que sufren las personas del colectivo. Sí, hay cuestiones fundamentales y específicas que hay que conocer para saber cómo acompañar personas en cualquier situación de vida, pero que tienen algún tipo de cualidad referida a esta temática. Entonces bueno, yo estoy coordinando un consultorio de diversidad de género en mi hospital y realmente se nota una diferencia entre los profesionales que simplemente aceptan que se atienda, digamos, como si fuera, bueno, no tenemos nada en contra, y otra muy diferente es cuando se visibilizan todas las microviolencias, los traumas cotidianos que se van vivenciando por la cuestión simplemente de pertenecer a tener una perspectiva de género, una identidad de género diferente y poder acompañar con sensibilidad esos procesos. Así que en todo ese contexto digo la bienvenida a Matthew, que es un experto en la temática, que viene trabajando en dispositivos en diversos lugares y que con mucha generosidad se acerca para darnos esta presentación sobre terapias contextuales y perspectivas de género en este contexto que, bueno, Matthew por ahí estará sensibilizado que estamos viendo en Argentina, que es de cierto retroceso en lo que son derechos, no privilegios. ¿Sí? No privilegios. Bueno, así que bienvenido Matthew, perdón por lo extenso, pero quería dar un poco de contexto. El espacio es todo tuyo, si quieres agregar algo más sobre tu presentación, bienvenido y bueno, dale para adelante nomás. Quería decir una cosita más, una sola
All
cosita más.
right,
Que
thanks.
estamos por iniciar,
So,
Matthew le quería contar a la comunidad, si no me voy a olvidar, estamos por iniciar un dispositivo en el capítulo que atiende específicamente cuestiones de violencia en relación a género, así que
speaking
le quiero agradecer específicamente a Agustina Cantón, que tuvo la iniciativa, estamos acompañando ese dispositivo, digo porque después lo vamos a comunicar, pero quería anticiparlo porque se está haciendo un laburo de mucho valor en ese sentido. Bueno, muchas gracias, ahora sí. Perdón.
All right. So I titled this Standing Together Against Anti-LGBTQ Political Violence. This isn't like a standard sort of workshop. I thought that it might be great to share some of my thoughts on the state of the world and also share some of what we're dealing with in the US. Uh, and then I'll also be sharing some of the research on what promotes resilience, both for us, for our clients, and research I've done in other hostile anti-LGBTQ places. And so I usually like to start thinking about where it is or isn't safe to be LGBTQ, um, because generally it's not safe anywhere. Anti-LGBTQ violence and hostile laws have been on the rise globally in recent years, um, with a specific focus against trans people and gender diverse people. The photo I included of Sam Nordquist below has just been reported broadly in the US this past week. Sam Nordquist was a 24-year-old trans man who was abducted and, as best we can tell from the investigations, was tortured brutally for around a month before before being murdered by his captors. Here in the US, Trump's first actions in office, right around the time your president, Mele, was speaking to the Davos Forum about trans people, were to ban X gender markers on passports, or those sex markers where it would say X instead of M or F to indicate a non-binary identity. When individuals had applications in for a new passport, if they previously had a passport with another sex, or if they had access to records to suggest this was a trans person, they would reverse the sex marker on their passports. He attempted to ban all gender-related care for minors, though that's currently blocked by the courts. And there's been an attempt to remove the word transgender from every government-affiliated website. This includes the website, since it's a part of the Federal Parks Division of the US, for the Stonewall Memorial, which is where the gay rights movement began in the US. And according to most accounts, it was trans women who led the counter protests against police that were raiding bars and brutalizing LGBT people there. On State Department travel pages and recommendations around safety, every reference to trans people has also been removed in the past month. And the trend seems to be moving toward more oppressive action. This is, as of last year, I couldn't find a survey incorporating this year, but in over a 2-year period, you saw about a 15-point increase in support for criminalizing providing gender-affirming care for minors, not just banning, but criminalizing it. There are a number of states that have begun to propose that physicians should face fines or time in prison if they continue to provide care for children and minors who are experiencing their gender differently. And I should clarify, and I believe it's the same in Argentina, that there typically are no allowances or very minimal ones for surgeries, hormones, or other procedures below the age of typically 16 with hormones, or 18 for surgeries, although for many states, 18 is the limit. So a great deal of this panic, like all of the moral panics that are so common in our societies, are based more on myth and fear than they are on what's actually happening. And even as courts here have blocked actions, misinformation is being spread. So within days of Trump taking office, from the Center for Disease Control to the National Institutes of Health, we've had all of our research studies that were available to the public and federally funded, if they included anything about gender or sexuality, removed from their websites. A court order forced them back, but they now all have this label that you see in blue that notes that information on this page promoting gender ideology is extremely inaccurate and disconnected from the immutable biological reality that there are two sexes, male and female. The Trump administration rejects gender ideology and condemns the harms it causes to children by promoting their chemical and surgical mutilation, and to women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, well-being, and opportunities. The administration in this department reject it. So we have very similar governments at the moment in that they are promoting this animosity toward trans people and presenting trans people and to a separate and lesser degree LGBT people broadly as a threat to broader society. And this is the first time that I'm aware of at the federal level that the US has adopted this phrase gender ideology, which has been very popular in parts of Latin America or Eastern Europe previously. I'll talk about it in a moment, but this is a term that's become popular for just sort of a vague sense of threat around talking about gender. And so this can also be seen as part of a global moral panic that arguably began with Russia as the first major government signing an anti-propaganda law suggesting that speech or images related to LGBT people were harmful to children. Now, while this occurred in Russia, this was also a law that was heavily lobbied for by United States conservative religious groups. So it's important to consider that the movements that are anti-trans that we're all facing right now are global in nature, that we have the same forces and the same organizations, many of them, I'm sad to say, based here in the United States, using US wealth to popularize and promote this hostility. This was mirrored in Hungary in 1921, where they passed a similar law, but they specifically inserted it in the part of their legal texts that covered criminal penalties.
Recording in progress.
That covered criminal penalties for pedophilia and were in order to increase the perception that LGBTQ people harm children. And their law, for example, added fines for any television program with LGBT content or depictions prior to the 20-hour each day. Florida signed a law, the US's first, what's been called the Don't Say Gay law, which this was a law in 2022 that forbid educators from talking about anything related to LGBT communities, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And while originally the bill was able to be passed by focusing on earlier school age, there was immediately then a new law proposed the following term to begin increasing the age. And there are efforts nationwide in the US to try and extend such laws for all education from kindergarten through high school. And these laws are harmful for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which LGBTQ people began as LGBTQ children who are harmed, who are isolated as a result of these rules. They're affected by the pseudoscience. It fuels internalized stigma or self-hatred. And we've seen a wave of heartbreaking suicides of transgender young people, adolescents, teens across the US in recent years, related to some of the fears and harassment that they've been experiencing. And misinformation is happening everywhere and happening globally. One of the things that's very difficult in this area is that whenever a claim is made based on spurious science or fake research, it often leads to headlines over the entire world, but corrective information does not. So one example of this in Littman's study on proposing the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, the idea that some adolescents are very quickly through exposure on the internet, through other life difficulties, through peer pressure, begin identifying as trans. This is a concept that was reported widely around the world. Um, it appeared to be, the term rapid onset gender dysphoria appeared to have been made up by Littman, who, as a social and religious conservative, believed that this was what was happening, that this is why more trans children are being discussed or more kids are coming out. Um, and this belief she had that it was social contagion. And this was widely reported as data that she collected on children. It was published in a very prestigious research journal, though it's since finally been retracted by the journal. But despite the early coverage, all saying that she had conducted interviews with children, eventually it became clear, and it was obvious if you read through her paper carefully, that she only recruited and interviewed the conservative parents from conservative forums, in many cases alienated from their trans children, who also shared her belief that this is why young people come out as trans. There have been a number of studies since that actually look at the experiences of gender diverse and gender creative children that show that this is not a real thing, that this does not happen. One of my favorites is a study by Bauer where they actually looked at children who were going through the intake process in gender clinics and asking them about things related to how many transgender friends they have, if they talk to those friends online or in person, how long ago they met those friends. And what they found is that there's no association with knowing people with high support or low support from transgender friends. There's no association between whether or not you've met trans peers online or in person. And there was no association in her study with mental health outcomes. So the American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, a number of others have all signed statements saying that this idea of social contagion, that rapid onset gender dysphoria, or that adopting a trans identity through peer pressure does not have any evidence behind it, but it still manages to be repeated again and again internationally. This also goes hand in hand with promoting the idea of sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. This is a term that's caught on in the US as an alternative to referring to conversion therapy, since conversion therapy neither converts anyone from their sexual orientation or gender identity, nor is it a legitimate therapy. But these are those attempts to change how particularly young people identify. One of the largest groups internationally that promotes this is the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. You can tell from this overly careful wording of their name that they're attempting to imply that this has something to do with being more scientific and caring more about providing options for clients than other therapists. But this was a name change from a group known as NARTH, the National Association for the Research and Treatment of Homosexuality. These advocates emphasize psychological research that's pretty poorly supported, or at least their interpretation is. First, they claim that minority stress, our primary lens for understanding how social bias harms LGBTQ people, is perhaps more a problem of neuroticism, and this is a citation from J. Michael Bailey, who's here in Chicago, where I am at Northwestern University, a separate university from me. But he argues that there are neuroanatomy similarities between gay men and women, such that much like he would believe that women are more neurotic than men, that therefore gay men and those gay men who choose to change their sex are neurotic like women are. These are bizarre beliefs, but these are the papers that are being cited by those who are attacking um, affirming care for LGBT people. It is also popular internationally to cite Lisa Diamond's work on sexual fluidity, that not everyone experiences their sexuality as rigidly fixed as either straight or gay, but the idea that individuals may experience some degree of fluidity across the lifespan does not mean and has never meant that psychotherapies appear able to change it. But I'm also introducing this idea of conversion therapies because many anti-trans activists, which I am sad to say includes even some LGBTQ activists, describe gender affirming care for minors as a type of conversion therapy. So you do have gay and lesbian activists in countries across the world that have attacked trans people and particularly trans children through claiming that that their own experiences of femininity or masculinity are being shaped by some sort of trans agenda. And we're also seeing more and more in the Western Hemisphere this adoption of opposition through claiming that they're opposing LGBT ideology or gender ideology. While these terms are used very fluidly to imply that there's some sort of belief that's being promulgated, it's really about creating a sense of menace or threat and a way of changing the focus from the fact that we're actually talking about individuals, families, and communities that are being attacked and harmed by politicians. And so, how do we care for ourselves and what do we propose for our clients? I know that not all of you may identify as members of queer or trans communities, but many of us who work within the community are in the community as well. And so I want to go through, before I get to my research, sources of resilience that have been identified by Glenda Russell as one of the first researchers beginning in the 1990s to really try and explore what factors hold up across contexts and across societies that are most associated with LGBT people thriving in the face um, of anti-LGBT politics. Now, this is a summary that she distributed after a shooting on a gay dance club in Orlando, Florida, that predominantly was popular among Latin American migrants to the U.S. and Latino Americans. So there are some references that I will make to that within this for the context, but that's why these are here. So the first of her factors is the idea of cultivating a movement perspective. We're part of a community that extends across time and place. Just like I am working with colleagues in the US to combat these efforts, you are working in Argentina to combat these. I've had the good fortune of meeting activists around the world. We're connected to other movements for equality. We cannot engage in this sort of work with also caring about legal efforts to chip away at the rights of or social status of women, of people of color, attacks and stereotypes against marginalized communities. In the shooting in Orlando, it was a Muslim identified man who had engaged in the shooting. But there are a lot of queer and trans Muslim people and Arab people who benefit from our own safe spaces. It's important to remember that none of us are working against each other. It does not mean that movements are ending or in trouble when this happens. When you look at the history of queer and trans rights, we are constantly ebbing and flowing since the start of the modern queer rights movement and arguably the 1890s of periods of intense backlash. Backlash happens to every change in rights. Movements will go forward even when they slow. and we have the power to make things happen, but should watch for where it's most effective to use our energy. Well, this ties to some of her other themes, but in Glenda Russell's research, in places where there are political attacks against our communities, she finds that people seem to be the most resilient when they're remembering this connection with broader movements and that we're part of a history. The next is to do something. I've seen beautiful images of the large marches in Argentina that have been happening over the past few weeks, and they have been inspiring to some of my own trans students here in the US who feel like we don't see as much visibility of marches against Trump right now. Active coping is almost always better than doing nothing. And we see this in our broader coping literature, and this does hold up when we look at queer and trans communities. This could also look like reading books on queer history, considering and reflecting and listing the positive experiences that have been brought into our life, finding places to express our feelings, to gather with friends, to donate money to important causes, and to volunteer with community organizations. In times when we feel most powerless, it's important to remember that there are things we could do. And with all of you on this call, for example, as therapists, there are ways that you could dedicate your resources to supporting the community, even if it doesn't feel like there's something you could do to change politicians. The next is to pay attention to your allies, or in her original studies, Glenda Russell used to call this factor successful witnessing. And I loved this idea of the importance of successfully noticing when are the straight and the cisgender people that we see standing up for and doing the things that we would like them to do. I'll talk in a moment about my research that I did in Poland when they had a very anti-LGBT government for the past few years. But there was one psychologist I met there who was a very active um, member of a number of activism organizations, educating the public, educating teachers. And when a right-wing journal published the name of him and his colleagues after they did a workshop at a school for working with LGBT teens and protecting them from bullying, a right-wing newspaper listed their names and their home addresses and phone numbers and said, these are pedophilia activists that have entered schools. So when this happened and he decided to take a step back from doing the direct work, his mother told him, you can take a break. You've done a lot of activism. Let me do it now. And so his mother started doing research and was at every pride and every protest march following that moment. So this is an example of what it means to both allow ourselves to ask for what we need, but to notice when cisgender and straight allies are stepping up and are doing things to show that they support our communities. Watching for negative messages and actively resisting them. I spent some time talking about some of the myths and some of the stereotypes that have gone global about LGBT people and some sort of threat that we are causing. Know that it's normal for these to come up in these times and resist them. And when you hear claims that you know sound like they must be wrong, but you also don't know that part of history of your local trans community, do research. Read trans histories. These are ways to connect with our history, to learn from elders in our communities, to learn from what they've accomplished. There's a South African freedom fighter, Stephen Biko, who said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So being aware that our own mindset is being attacked daily right now, and to do things to actively counter it. Find and make use of your local community, of the local queer and trans community. Go to the places where you feel safe. The more that the general population becomes uncertain, confusing, potentially threatening. Find the places where it feels safe. And this is active, um, an active form of giving, because as much as you feel safe when you go to a place with other visibly queer and trans people, you are adding to the number, and you are doing that for them too. So remembering that when you show up and you go to these places, it is for yourself and you're giving back. So supporting community events, using local tragedies or harms as opportunities to reconnect with the local community. Glenda Russell, which it's I don't know. I think this is possibly my ageism coming through, but I think it's cute because she's like this very aged, very tiny queer woman. And she also adds to the list, she says, have hot sex. You know, do the things that help you feel good in your body right now as a queer and trans person. And look at all the things that you've gained from this. And then finally, do the usual things that help people. Are you sleeping enough? Are you getting exercise? Are you taking care to eat things that nurture your body? Pay attention to the temptation to isolate, to cut yourself off, to not be out and in public or doing the things that you love or care for. And then, oh, I'm sorry, this is the final one. And then consider, or my final slide on this, consider how to apply them. So these are the 6 points again. Cultivate a movement perspective, do something, pay attention to your allies, watch and challenge the negative messages, find your local community, and do the usual things that help people. And so these points inspired me to do some research when I went to Poland. And this is where I'm going to transition a bit to talking about some of my work I've done in this area. So I had a research leave in 2021. Here I am with a hat that I really loved and I can't find right now in the center of Warsaw. And so I chose to go to Poland for a number of reasons. One was that I had done work with the queer and trans community in Hungary for a number of years, but in order to get a research visa, you have to have a local academic who writes a letter of support. And anti-trans and anti-gender research movements by their own anti-LGBT government had led every faculty person that I knew to flee the country. And so I thought, I've never really been to Poland, but I have colleagues there and I know that they're copying the same laws. And I know that groups like the World Congress of Families, based here in Chicago, are donating tens of millions of dollars a year to promote anti-LGBT laws in Poland. So I reached out to colleagues and went there. At the time, just like the US does now, Poland had their executive, legislative, and judicial branch all controlled by a far-right political party. They'd made similar rules regarding limits on care, and they had public and political figures who were promoting sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts or conversion therapy. An example of the type of cruel approach taken to healthcare and taken to policymaking in Poland is that shortly after I left, when mpox was sweeping the globe and affecting almost exclusively gay, bi, and queer men, Poland was one of the few countries in Europe that was being affected. That where the president at the time made a statement that they would only order 2,000 doses of the vaccine, and those doses were only to be used by frontline or emergency room nurses or doctors to protect them in case they were exposed by infected LGBT people, but that for queer and bi men who were exposed to mpox, that whatever pain they might experience was their own fault and they would not be vaccinated. So this was the type of attitude in the government at the time. And so I was inspired by Glenda Russell's research, and I wanted to see what was helping people to thrive there. For some context, it's considered one of the most or it's been considered the most anti-LGBT country within the European Union. Um, and a number of parts of the country, as you could see in the map, had designated themselves as LGBT-free zones. This was after the mayor of Warsaw gave a speech saying that LGBT people were equal citizens and welcome to be themselves in Warsaw. And so you had a wave of politicians declaring that that was not true for where they lived, that LGBT people should feel unsafe and should not feel accepted in being publicly visible. And in surveys, almost all LGBT people in Poland indicated experiencing microaggressions, more than 2/3 experiencing violence, 1/3, 1 in 3 experiencing persistent cyberbullying, so harassing anonymous messages. And this is not, I often think of cyberbullying as something that affects young people. In Poland, there were a number of stories of adults, professionals in their 30s, 40s, 50s, working in the community that would begin receiving dozens or hundreds of harassing messages and threatening messages until moving. 1 in 10 Polish queer and trans people describe being kicked out of their home. And at the highest rate in the EU, 15% described physical or sexual attacks. In terms of their response, 75% or more than 80% of trans people avoided talking about their identity at all in fear of discrimination. About 70% of LGBT and trans people reported avoiding certain places out of fear of discrimination. 68% reported feeling lonely and isolated. Almost 2/3 met criteria for moderate to severe depression versus just over 4% of the general population. And more than half described experiencing suicidal ideation. These are serious numbers, though. I loved this photo I found of an anti-trans rally in Poland because the signs simply state "Stop Gender," while absolutely every man and woman in this photo appears to be aggressively attempting to embody and present themselves in a particularly gendered way. So none of us are good at stopping gender. So general observations before I get into the data I found. As I met and interviewed individuals, I found that just like rights and social attitudes change as you travel across the US and across states, being a part of the EU impacted it impacted how people experienced their rights because they knew that there were other places that they could be treated differently very close by. And this is something that I imagine with bordering states that also have progressive laws with Argentina, that this will also add stress, knowing if I were born or if I lived 1,000 kilometers this way or that way, that I would still have the rights that feel under attack right now. I also observed that many college-educated Polish people took advantage of a program called the Erasmus system, which allowed them to move and live for free for 1 year in a different country in the EU to study during college. And for those who went to a place that had broad acceptance, it changed their sense of what was possible and what they should expect. When we're exposed to places and we're able to feel the safety of a place where there's acceptance, it changes what we assume we deserve. I also saw the opposite pattern of those who had not. This might be something that you'll see in your own clients of those who have had periods of their life. I know Buenos Aires is a very international city. people who have lived in places where they experienced equality versus those who have not may experience stress differently. And also, much like Latin America, Slavic Europe is many parts of it are more collectivist than individualist. So I knew individuals who had come out to their families, had some family members that no longer spoke to them, or one parent would no longer speak to them, and they would still be joining their families for Sunday dinner. So these sorts of experiences also can add to the stressors. But it's also, there are a lot of new cultural examples of connecting with history. There's a new wave globally. And while I've seen films from Argentina, I don't know of the local history books. Perhaps that's something that could be shared in chat if you know of them. But knowing where our local communities come from, the histories of queer and trans activism, knowing the great figures in trans activism locally, these promote resilience. So in my first study, I was wanting to, this was a survey study where I was looking at queer and trans people. Um, this is graffiti from a large city in Poland where someone had spray painted "fuck LGBT" outside of someone's window. Jebać LGBT. So inspired by Glenda Russell's work, uh, again, these factors, I worked with Polish colleagues and we developed a pool of items to test these. How well were different practices related to what Glenda Russell proposed? Um, how well were those actually helping people there? And so we were able to recruit 253 participants. They were, while they ranged in age from 18 to 48, they were generally quite young. The average age was 22. The survey was conducted in Polish, um, so through measures that already existed or that we did the work to translate. And so for a broader sense in terms of participants, bisexual orientation, about half identified as bisexual and another 15% as pansexual. So almost 2/3 as bi or pan. Um, Around 20% identified as gay or lesbian, 3% heterosexual trans people participated, 6% ace. Um, and then when we look at participants by gender identity, uh, 2/3 were cisgender women and men. The rest were non-binary, trans, or possessed another gender identity. So we took some, I could share more of how we did this methodologically later, but we used different restrictions in our recruitment software to guarantee that we would have more than 25% of our sample as gender minoritized people, because we did not want to wind up with only gay and lesbian participants. And so these are the findings in a nutshell. What we found is that the daily heterosexist discrimination um, led to an increase in anticipated stigma, or the belief that you were going to be stigmatized or face bias, which is itself a source of distress. And that the more and that whether or not you believed you'd encounter it, experiential avoidance, for those of you who are contextual behavioral therapists, experiential avoidance was the bridge where the fear of encountering bias and mental health outcomes like depressive and anxiety symptoms depended on the degree to which you were trying to avoid them. We found that queer resistance or resilience that the ways in which people were engaged in those factors that Glenda Russell proposed, that those weakened the relationship between experiences with daily discrimination and attempts to avoid those experiences. We only found two factors in our data that were strongly supportive. One was community resistance. So this includes things like joining marches, participating in the local community, gathering together with queer and trans friends during times of attack. And then the other that we labeled ally resistance, that was that paying attention to allies piece, where the cisgender and heterosexual people in your life standing up for you as well, joining you at the marches, voicing their support. We found no difference between large cities or small rural villages. This appeared to hold up across them. And so while this work has not been done at this point that I'm aware of in Argentina, though I don't know, perhaps I should reach out after to Fundación Foro and we could see if we could collect data or explore doing some similar data collection in Argentina. Um, this seems to be what was most important in this other context. And then the next study I did, which I think might be relevant for many of you, was looking at provider activists. What happens when you're both a therapist and an activist in the community? Because what occurs in much of the world, and this may be many of your experience, some people begin as activists and they see the activists around them burning out, suffering from taking on the burden of so much weight, of focusing all of the time on political attacks, and they decide there's healing that needs to happen in our community. Someone needs to support the fighters in our community. Or what happens is that therapists see the ways that psychology, that psychological science or psychotherapy, and the prestige of psychiatry and psychology are used as weapons against queer and trans communities. They see leaders in mental health spaces advocating for conversion therapy, repeating unscientific, harmful stereotypes about trans and queer people, and they say, I also need to be an activist. And so the countries you could see highlighted in pink are all of the ones that I traveled throughout and interviewed participants in. So from Poland to Croatia, I was interested in what it's like to bridge this. How do you garner support? You know, we as therapists can't show up at a march or a rally and expect the people around us to support us in the same way as if we're in a small community and the people marching alongside us are our clients. So where do we get support from? And do we experience our support, the support of those in our community, or do we experience support from those within the mental health profession as well? Or have we been enduring since our own training bias? And so we found a number of themes preliminarily. We actually, I'm just realizing that I hadn't updated these based on speaking with members of the community because uh, because we got some feedback on how some of them are framed. But the main themes were about the importance of self-discovery and having freedom for that, how important family can be when they're a source of support, or the ways that it undermines our experiences when they're not. The fact that whether we are currently engaging in activism or not, we are always subject to what we're hearing about what's occurring politically, and that this weighs on us as practitioners. That our own field is often a source of oppression. that many individuals shared. And I certainly had this experience even when in the United States in a well-ranked program of you have faculty, you have people who train you in psychotherapy who are also biased, who make anti-LGBT statements, who make comments about the mental health or in support of discrimination regarding LGBT people. And then finally, this idea of finding a future, that what many of the individuals I interviewed across those national lines were saying was what we need most is to hold on to our own sense of hope that we're working toward something. And and one of the ways that that was expressed, something to try on for yourself, is that many of them were able to label a city, a neighboring country, some place in the world that they had been or were able to go back to again, where they felt like things felt different, where it seemed like things were moving in the right direction. And so being able to do that is incredibly powerful. Many emphasized having a partner as a way to have community and support separate from their activism and therapy practice. What I want you to take as the take home of this, though, is not to pat yourself on the back if you have a supportive partner, although that's lovely. What I want you to take from this is that this means that your single queer and trans colleagues might need more support, might need to know more that you're there for them and can support them in these moments. Most discussed, I was mentioning this before, the importance of having physical spaces to be in where they did not have to monitor themselves or worry about danger. Paul Gilbert, who created compassion-focused therapy, has recently really emphasized the distinction between safety and safeness. Safety, meaning there is not a threat that someone will attack me right now. Safeness, meaning that I'm surrounded by people that I could be vulnerable and authentic with, that I could actually feel all of my feelings fully, and that they will support me being in this moment with them. We need both. It's not enough just to be safe from harm. We need safeness with people around us. Um, I chose, just for a quick aside, I chose this quirky photo because almost all of them, since it was in Europe, mentioned Berlin as a city where they were able to completely forget about their gender expression and their sexual orientation and just be themselves and walk through the world. And so these are men posing in front of Berghain, which is a famous club in Berlin. So Berlin loomed large, particularly among queer men, but not exclusively. But this is just worth holding in mind that if you predominantly work with gay men, lesbians, and there are places that they have told you they feel safe, it may be different than the places that your trans clients feel safe. So being sure to explore and probe this. Many continued to find outlets for activism in the face of extreme bias. So I was constantly struck by the courage of those I interviewed, that when we encounter violence, aggression, or backlash in our activism, um, considering new ways to engage in activism can be helpful and meaningful. Maybe it does mean you stop what you're doing, but that doesn't mean you have to stop. In the Balkans, different experiences by gender were emphasized. So there's a pattern in many countries, for example, where effeminate gay men or trans women receive most violence or are murdered more than masculine women or trans men. But these patterns differ regionally, by city, following. I mean, I opened with a story of a trans man being brutally murdered in the US. So these are not static things. Paying attention to your local community about and being mindful about the discussions you have around safety and safeness. And so I think for me, it makes it most important to consider our own values, our own ethics about our responsibilities. I share with my students my belief that when social attitudes change in a manner that results in harm, specifically harms that are measured and observed in our clinical work, we have a special platform and a role in attempting to remedy those sources of distress. And I know I'm coming right up against the end. I just have a couple last slides I want to share. One is that sexual orientation and gender diverse people, it is worth noting, are not suffering. We're not only suffering in the world. Across the globe, we are also still dancing in clubs and falling in love and dressing authentically. When I was in Eastern Europe, Denmark had laws where you could get married regardless of your nationality. So people would fly from anti-gay countries to get marriage licenses in Denmark. We march in the streets, we volunteer, we raise children, celebrate holidays, kiss in public, find the place like Berlin that feels free. And I'm going to skip the closing meditation, but I came across this beautiful quote the other day by James Baldwin, a Black queer writer from the US who was a strong critic of the ways that the US was constantly failing to live up as a free society. Um, he wrote, "The longer I live, the more deeply I learn that love, whether we call it friendship or family or romance, is the work of mirroring and magnifying each other's light. Gentle work, steadfast work, life-saving work in those moments when life and shame and sorrow occlude our own light from our view, but there is still a clear-eyed, loving person to beam it back." As therapists, we're used to being the loving person beaming it back. So I also urge those of you doing this work in this time to make sure that you also have loving eyes beaming back at you. And so I'm going to stop sharing there. And I know we're right up at the end, but I have a few more moments. So if anyone did want to stay, if it's allowable to hear any comments or thoughts, I'd welcome that. Thank you.
Bueno, impresionante presentación, Matthew. Muchísimas gracias. En nombre de toda la comunidad, me parece que se nota fuertemente lo necesaria que es, ¿no?, la concientización. Realmente te agradecemos muchísimo, sos un experto, escritor de libros, investigador y además
No
tan
se
comprometido.
escucha. Hay alguien hablando y no se escucha.
No se escucha en el canal en inglés, me parece, ¿puede ser? Pero, bien. Bueno, te queremos agradecer muchísimo, Matthew, por la predisposición. También a Ale, no sé, Ale, si querés agregar algo. Yo, la verdad que la valoración que tenemos por
No
este...
sé si a mí se me dejó de escuchar o no se escucha.
A ver.
Probablemente estás en otro canal. No sé quién está hablando.
Sí, puede ser, Marielen, ¿eh? Creo que estás en otro canal. Bueno, le decía a Ale, también no quiero olvidarme de agradecerle a todo el equipo que colaboró del chapter, increíble. No me quiero olvidar de nadie, pero están acá presentes todos, Débora, Sol,
De verdad, pues,
Calo,
weón, mira.
Agus, Sol, ya este nombre, ¿no? Sol, creo que sí. Bueno, que hicieron posible el encuentro desde pruebas, con el Zoom, la comunicación con Ale también. Bueno, Ale, no sé si querés vos también decir alguna palabra de agradecimiento a Matthew, tiene un vínculo tan lindo de acompañarse.
Si tuviera que decir palabras de agradecimiento por todos estos años que Matt me estuvo acompañando y se transformó en mi mentor y me apoyó y salieron ideas y chateamos y nos mandamos emojis y bla, 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 no termino nunca. Así que simplemente muchas, muchas, muchas gracias. Nada más.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias, Ale, también. Bueno, y yo la verdad que me siento emocionado, conmovido. Creo que el llamado también es de la emoción pasar a acciones de visibilización, de toma de conciencia, de sensibilización, ¿no? En nuestros consultorios, en nuestros lugares de trabajo, de vida, seamos parte de una identidad diversa o no. Me pareció súper importante también el llamado que hace Mati a cómo acompañar, ¿no? Desde nuestro lugar como seres humanos o como terapeutas. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos. Vamos a tratar de seguir manteniendo el tema vigente todo el año, porque nos parece súper necesario, ¿no? Creo que a veces creemos que ya ganamos derechos, pero se nota que hay que seguir defendiendo, apoyando, ¿no? Porque siempre están ahí como estas tendencias a volver hacia atrás. Así que nos parecen como colectivo, como chapter y como comunidad súper importante. Así que agradecemos la presencia de todos, que realmente que haya habido tantas personas también es un gesto de apoyo, ¿no? Para Matthew, para todos quienes estemos comprometidos con la causa de los derechos, ¿no? Por la diversidad de género. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos. No sé si hay alguien más que quiera decir algo, si no, gracias. Nos vemos a hacer un próximo encuentro. Ya tendrán más noticias sobre actividades del chapter. Estamos con muchas ideas y propuestas, así que, bueno, muy agradecido de poder brindárselas a ustedes como comunidad. Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias, Matthew, Ale, y a todo el equipo y a la comunidad.
Thank you, Manu, for translating.
Y Manu Terraf, impecable tu interpretación.
Manu. Totalmente. Manu, increíble, increíble. Parte del chapter.
Maravilloso. Perfecto.
Genial, muchísimas gracias. Gracias a Ícaro por ayudarme. Bueno, abrazo a todos, cariños. Chao, chao.
Hasta luego.
Wow.